I'm Liz Harmon, and welcome to Snack Sized Civics. It's sponsored by the League of Women Voters and the VFW. Today, we're lucky enough to get to talk about separation of powers with our retired librarian, who also has another history, Mary Haney. Welcome so much, Mary. We're glad to have you.
Thank you, Liz.
Can you tell me today exactly what is separation of powers, why it's important, and what would happen if it broke down and we lost it?
Wow, that's a lot in a short space of time. I would like to start by saying not only was I a librarian here in Detroit Lakes, but I also practiced law here for a number of years, which means I studied constitutional law in law school, like all lawyers in Minnesota. Now, that does not make me an expert in constitutional law, but I do have some familiarity with the basic concepts of our Constitution, and one of the most basic ones, coming from the text and structure of the Constitution itself, is the idea of separation of powers. It's quite a simple idea, but in actual application in the governance of the United States over the years, it has gotten very complicated. It's the idea that if you keep any one branch of government from having too much power in the basic functions of government, then you will prevent any one branch from taking over. So, having just fought a long and expensive war to get out from under the tyranny of the British monarchy, the framers of the Constitution were very leery of setting up a government that could be corrupted into a dictatorship or another monarchy of some kind. Concentrating too much governmental power in a single entity could result in arbitrary and oppressive government action and could damage the rights of the people. In order to prevent this from happening, the framers set up separate and independent branches of the federal government that would exercise each of government's three basic functions, which are the legislative, executive, and judicial functions of government. This is the doctrine called the separation of powers. The text of the Constitution itself does not expressly refer to the separation of powers, but the separation of powers shows up in how the Constitution sets up those three branches of government, the specific powers that are reserved to those branches, and it provides for the framework for the checks and balances built into our Constitution. Now, just in case you don't remember your 8th or 9th grade civics class, the legislative branch of our United States government is supposed to make the laws. The executive branch has the responsibility to enforce and administer the laws passed by Congress. The judicial branch of our government determines the meaning of laws passed by Congress and how they should be applied in individual cases, and ensures the laws are consistent with the Constitution, which includes all the amendments to the Constitution. So we'll take a little closer look at the powers reserved to the three branches of government. The first three articles of the U.S. Constitution set out the branches of government. The first one, Article 1, says, all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and House of Representatives. And then other sections of Article 1 lay out what the specific powers that Congress shall have are, which include, but are not limited to, the power to set and collect taxes. That's one we're all familiar with, right? Pay bills, borrow money, declare war, establish an army, and regulate commerce for the nation and regulate commerce between the states. It also gives Congress specifically the power to override a veto by the president, with specific information on how Congress can do this. The fact that only Congress can actually declare war serves as one of the checks on presidential power built right into the Constitution. Article 2 establishes the executive branch. It says the executive power shall be vested in a President of the United States. In the Constitution, the President is given the authority to veto legislation, which serves as a check on Congress, and the President has the authority to appoint heads of government departments and to remove those same heads of government departments, to appoint ambassadors to represent the interests of the United States in other countries, to make treaties and agreements with other countries. And for some of these functions, the President has to obtain the advice and consent of the Senate. That's right in the Constitution. So a President can appoint a Supreme Court justice, but the Senate can refuse to consent to such an appointment. That's another check on a presidential power. The third branch of our government is the judicial branch, established in Article 3 of the Constitution, and that simply says the judicial power of the United States shall be vested in one Supreme Court and in such inferior courts as the Congress may from time to time ordain and establish. Now, the Supreme Court has the authority to review laws passed by Congress and to review actions taken by the President and to interpret them. If it finds these laws or actions are contrary to the Constitution, it can declare them unconstitutional and set them aside. This power of the Supreme Court provides checks and balances on the power of both other branches of government. So that's in a nutshell how the separation of powers works. But as you can tell, it's a little more complicated than that. Even at the time they were writing the Constitution, the framers contemplated some overlap in the branch's performance of functions, and in particular, they favored an approach that seeks to maintain independence for each branch while promoting a workable government through the interdependence and sharing of power among the branches. So it takes a balancing act. There have been many cases over the course of our history in which the Supreme Court has elaborated on the separation of powers document. So it's been very important in keeping us free from any kind of a dictatorship or autocracy. And it's still in play today. A current example of how the separation of powers works is in relation to tariffs. The President has been in the process of placing tariffs on other countries' goods coming into the United States. Well, to me, tariffs are a form of taxation, and that's one of the powers that is set aside for Congress. So why isn't Congress involved in setting these tariffs? Well, the answer is that in the last century, Congress delegated the power to impose tariffs to the executive branch of government. That is, to the President and the executive departments. In the 1930s, the 1960s, and again in the 1970s, Congress enacted legislation that authorized the President to decide on tariffs. They felt at those times that really that was more related to foreign policy than it really was to a legislative action. So they delegated it away to the President. Of course, these laws were challenged in court as violating the separation of powers and therefore were unconstitutional. Well, the Supreme Court took a look at all these separate cases and basically decided they were not unconstitutional and that the Congress had the right to delegate this authority over tariffs to the President. So that's a great example of all three branches of government dealing with a current separation of powers issue. So still important, still helping us prevent from sliding into a autocracy or a dictatorship. So that's a little bit about the separation of powers. There is a great website on the Constitution, and it has a lot of information, more information on the separation of powers at constitution.congress.gov. It's an annotated copy of the U.S. Constitution, which it's, of course, very extensive and very complicated, but also very informative. So.
Thank you so much. So in answer to that last question, what would happen if we lost it? We could end up with an autocracy,
right,
or a dictatorship or
well,
something to that
like that.
Yeah.
An oligarchy of the Supreme
Yeah.
Court, that seems very unlikely.
Right. Okay. Well.
But yeah, it keeps our government in the shape it was meant to be, with the three branches balancing each other out.
Well, thank you so much, Mary. I really appreciate your coming and joining us to give us a little history or civics again for those of us that's been a few decades, right?
Right, exactly.
If you would like to sponsor an episode of Snack Sized Civics, please contact a League of Women Voters member or contact the League right through the website at the end of this program. And we'll probably add that website that you mentioned too.
Okay.
Thanks so much, Mary, and thank you for joining us for Snack Sized Civics.